HOA started with a simple, cruel little act. The HOA thought they could teach me a lesson. Early one morning, I noticed the water line had been cut. Just a prank, they probably thought, harmless, a slap on the wrist. But then I watched, and their world began to unravel. Fountains sputtered, pools ran dry, lawns curled in the sun, neighbors banged on doors, confused, frustrated, desperate. Their carefully manicured paradise was evaporating literally. What they didn't know, the aquifer beneath their streets, their lawns, their sparkling pools, belonged to me. Every pipe, every drop traced back to a system my grandfather had built decades ago, legally mine. And when the state inspectors arrived, armed with law and authority, their smug little prank turned into disaster. Fines were issued, theft documented, and every single gallon accounted for. The HOA plan to teach me a lesson didn't just fail. It backfired spectacularly, leaving me in control of the very water they had tried to steal. It was early morning when I first noticed something was wrong. The subtle trickle of water in my kitchen faucet had slowed to a whisper. At first, I thought it was a minor glitch, a simple plumbing issue. But when I stepped outside, the truth became immediately clear. The HOA had cut my water line. Their motive was petty yet brazen, to teach me a lesson. Apparently, my insistence on maintaining my property exactly as I wanted had ruffled feathers in their neat, perfectly manicured neighborhood. The cutting of my water line was meant as intimidation, a statement, "We're in control, you'll obey." I could almost hear Karen's smug voice echoing in my mind. Let's see how he likes this. At first, a part of me wanted to laugh. It was audacious, almost amateurish. Their idea of power was a mere hose in the ground. But as I glanced toward the neighboring homes, I noticed something strange. The pools were stagnant, fountains sputtered, sprinklers that had once danced across lush lawns now sprayed nothing. A chill ran down my spine. Their petty sabotage wasn't confined to me, it had backfired immediately. The water line they'd tampered with wasn't just my own, it was connected to the entire system supplying the neighborhood. And that system, I realized, was legally mine. Every drop traced back to the aquifer my grandfather had developed decades ago, every pipe and valve fully under my ownership. I walked down to inspect the main line, sunlight glinting off the metal valves, dust rising around the carefully laid pipes. Their cutting job was crude, an angry bulldozer of a move, a slapdash attempt to intimidate. But they had no idea they had just exposed themselves to something far worse than compliance. By mid-morning, chaos had begun to ripple through the neighborhood. Neighbors banged on doors, shouting, panicked. HOA officers, self-important and smug, attempted to reassure everyone, claiming it was a minor technical error. But I had the advantage, the proof of ownership, the historical documentation, the legal leverage all in my hands. I called my lawyer, detailing the incident while calmly assessing the damage. Meanwhile, state inspectors were summoned. Their arrival was dramatic. Trucks, uniforms, clipboards, cameras, the weight of authority descending on a neighborhood that had tried to bully one man into submission. The HOA petty lesson had transformed into a full-blown investigation. Every pipe, every valve, every connection would be examined. Their arrogance had triggered a chain of events they couldn't stop. What they thought was a simple act of intimidation had now become a legal nightmare. And I, standing on my property, surveying the water system that had been my family's legacy for decades, felt a deep sense of quiet satisfaction. They wanted to teach me a lesson. Fine, let them learn the consequences of underestimating me. Little did they know this was just the beginning. By late morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with panic. Sprinklers had stopped spraying, pools were half empty, and fountains that once sparkled under the sun now sat stagnant. Neighbors peeked out of windows, whispered among themselves, and began banging on doors, demanding explanations. The HOA, usually the ones calling the shots, looked completely disoriented. I stood on my porch, calm and composed, knowing exactly what was happening beneath their manicured lawns. Every drop of water flowing through their pipes traced back to the aquifer my grandfather had built decades ago. Legally, it was mine. Every valve, every junction, every reservoir under my ownership. When the state inspectors arrived, their presence was formidable. Trucks with official markings, inspectors with clipboards and cameras, and engineers with sensors and meters flooded the neighborhood. Karen, the HOA president, tried to maintain her composure, striding through the streets with the usual airs of authority. But the confident smirk quickly faded when the inspectors began checking connections, tapping valves, and taking readings. This entire system, it's legally owned by Mr. Your last name, one inspector said, clearly stunned as he confirmed the records. Every line, every reservoir, this HOA has no ownership over the water supply. Karen froze. Her attempted act of intimidation had backfired spectacularly. What she had thought was a simple cut, a harmless lesson for a defiant neighbor, had just escalated into legal exposure, public humiliation, and potential fines. Neighbors gathered, whispering, shocked that the HOA had been siphoning water from a system they didn't even own. Some pulled out phones, recording the chaos as Karen's authority crumbled before everyone's eyes. The arrogance, the carefully maintained illusion of power all gone. Karen's protests became frantic. This isn't fair. We were just enforcing community standards. She shouted, voice cracking. But the inspectors, armed with law, documentation, and evidence, paid her no mind. Every stolen gallon was being accounted for, every pipe mapped, every violation recorded. Meanwhile, I walked among the homes, calm and measured. My grandfather's engineering genius had built more than just a water system. It had created leverage, control, and protection for anyone who understood its true ownership. And now, the HOA was learning the hard way. By mid-afternoon, fines were being issued. Orders were drafted. Every homeowner who had unknowingly depended on HOA managed water was informed of the mismanagement, and Karen's desperate attempts to justify herself rang hollow. The community's water supply had been misappropriated, and now the full weight of legal authority was descending on her. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, I knew one thing. The HOA had underestimated not just me, but the legacy and rights of my family. What they thought would be a lesson in fear had become a public display of their incompetence, exposing them for what they truly were, bullies with no real authority, and the final act, the one that would cement justice, was about to unfold. By the next morning, Karen's confidence had completely evaporated. Her attempts at intimidation, once loud and aggressive, now sounded hollow and desperate. The neighborhood that had feared her authority was buzzing with whispers, some confused, some vindicated, but all watching as the truth came to light. State inspectors, armed with surveys, legal documents, and water usage records, moved through the neighborhood methodically. Each meter read, each pipe traced, confirmed the same shocking reality. The HOA had no legal right to the water they had been using or attempting to control. Every act of sabotage, every cut line, every threatened fine null and void. Karen tried to intervene, waving her clipboard, shouting about community rules and covenants. But the inspectors paid her no attention. The evidence was overwhelming. They issued fines, formally documenting the HOA theft, and ordered immediate restitution. Every gallon of water that had been taken from the aquifer without permission would be accounted for and billed back to them. Neighbors began to gather outside, watching the unraveling spectacle. Their eyes, wide with disbelief, followed Karen as her aura of control crumbled. The woman who had once strutted through the streets with authority was now reduced to frantic protests and nervous glances. Her reign of fear and intimidation had ended not with a fight, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of law. I stood on my porch surveying the scene. Pools were slowly filling again, sprinklers humming back to life, fountains dancing under the afternoon sun. Every drop of water that had been wrongfully taken was now being restored, and the HOA was left to deal with the consequences of its greed and overreach. Karen's humiliation was complete. Fines issued, violations recorded, and a court order confirming the aquifer's ownership. She had no leverage left. The HOA, which had thrived on bullying residents, had been exposed for what it really was: a fragile network of intimidation, crumbling under the authority of one man who knew his rights and his family's legacy. By sunset, the neighborhood had returned to normal, The chaos of the past days, the frustration, the panic, all replaced by a calm sense of justice. Residents whispered to each other, sharing stories of the HOA downfall, realizing the power of understanding and standing by legal rights. I walked through the property, feeling the satisfaction of quiet victory. The water supply, the lifeblood of the community, was mine legally, undeniably mine. What had begun as a petty act of vengeance by the HOA ended as a decisive lesson in authority, legacy, and the consequences of underestimating someone who knows exactly what they own. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, reflecting off the restored fountains and sparkling pools, one thing was crystal clear: never, ever try to bully someone who controls the source.